Good evening, everyone. I'm Stephen Aaron. I am the chair of the UCLA History Department, and it's my real pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Why History Matters program. This is a first for us in that we are partnering tonight, not for the last time though, with the Department of African American Studies, and it's really a delight to have worked with them to develop this program on why Black women's lives and histories matter. It's my pleasure to welcome this evening and ask to say a few words our new Dean of Social Sciences, Professor Darnell Hunt. Thank you, Darnell.
Thank you, Steve. I'll keep this sweet and to the point. I'm really excited to see this collaboration between the Departments of History and African American Studies, because here in the Division of Social Sciences, this is what we're all about. Collaboration, about research that's engaged, that deals with the social issues that confront us today. And what more important social issue is there than the lives and the histories of Black women, particularly at this political moment? So without further ado, I'd like to say welcome to you all on behalf of the Division of Social Sciences, and I look forward to enjoying the talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Darnell. All right. Okay. So then, without further ado, Marcus Hunter.
Thank you.
Chair of the Department of African American Studies and the new Scott Waugh Endowed Chair.
Thank you. And also, father of dragons, first of the men, so on and so forth. So thank you everybody for coming. I really want to shout out, as they say in LA, to the big homie, the Department of History, for collaborating with us and let us bounce on their format and hopefully keep it intact afterwards. And also to Steve Aaron, who's been like a wonderful friend, a wonderful colleague, especially starting this new job this year. So I appreciate you dearly. Really quickly, part of what we're trying to do in African American Studies, since we're a baby in the unit, we're a recent department, is to try to brand ourselves by presenting programming that really amplifies the lives of Black people here, there, and everywhere, in the words of Gwendolyn Brooks. And part of that effort is making sure that we present programming, particularly during Black History Month. What better time to announce ourselves and celebrate ourselves than in this particular month, though I've been reclaiming days. So we technically started with Bootsy Collins on January 30th. So just a quick thing next week, and we have a new tool that we call the Black Calendar, which you can find on the Department of African American Studies website. All things Black that we know about, we want you all to know about, you can find on that department website. But importantly, next week we will have one of the grandfathers of Black politics, Michael Dawson, here. On Monday, February 12th. His talk will be titled Support for Black Reparations in the Early 21st Century. That'll be over from 12 to 2 in the Black Forum, Haynes 153. But again, you can find that on the Black Calendar as our other events that we have upcoming. Without further ado, I'm just gonna give some introductions for our wonderful panelists, all of whom graciously said yes, and all of whom I admire deeply, and I think you will come to understand why we all admire them here after you hear their comments. So we're going to go first with Professor Brenda E. Stevenson, and I'll do their intro right before they go, so then that way you don't have to listen to me much longer. Professor Stevenson is a professor of history at UCLA. She matriculated at the University of Virginia and then went to Yale, first to the MA program in African American Studies, and then to the PhD program in American History. Her doctoral advisor was John W. Blassingame, shout out to the OG. Other mentors include Nancy Cott, David Bryan Davis, Edmund Morgan, VP Franklin, Paul Gadsden, Arnold Rampersad, Skip Gates, Joseph Miller, Barry Gaspar, and Darlene Clark Hine. Professor Stevenson's MA work produced the Journals of Charlotte Fortin, Oxford 1988. That's just MA, just producing, wow. Her dissertation became the award-winning Life in Black and White, Family and Community in the Slave South. That's Oxford 1996. Since then, she has contributed several groundbreaking articles, book chapters, and essays on slave social life and the experiences of enslaved women and children. She's also co-authored The Underground Railroad, served as a guest editor of 2 editions on enslaved women from the Journal of African American History, and served as as a co-editor of the Encyclopedia of Black Women's History, Professor Stevens' 2013 book, which I love very much, The Contested Murder of Latasha Harlins, Justice, Gender, and the Origins of the LA Riots, also published by Oxford. It won the Organization of American History's Raleigh Prize for the best book on the history of race relations in the US. She also published What is Slavery in 2015 by Polity Press, and is currently completing a book on slave families and another on enslaved women. I am happy to present to you Professor Stevens, who also is a recipient of numerous awards, including support from the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, the American Academy in Berlin, the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences, the National Humanities Center, the AAUW, and the Ford and Andrew Mellon Foundations. She is quite simply the business, the bee's knees, and it is my great pleasure to present Professor Stevenson.
That was really wonderful. And I want to thank the Departments of African American Studies and History, of course, for this important forum. And I am blessed, or I feel blessed to be here among you. I'm going to begin, you'll see some images that are going to roll behind me because I, as a historian, am going to speak the history. Okay, so I'm going to begin this evening with a gruesome illustration that I believe will underscore the imperative of Black women's history, not only because Black women's lives matter, but because our history so well illustrates the persistent problems that marginalized peoples, particularly women, have within our society. This story, I believe, aptly brings together, albeit briefly, the recurring themes stamped on the history of Black women's bodies and lives represented in the current hashtag movements. Hashtag #MeToo, hashtag Time's Up, and hashtag Black Lives Matters. This story is part of the autobiography of an enslaved woman, Susan Black, told to her by Dr. Esther Hill Hawks, a physician who had come to work among the contraband, that is, people newly freed during the Civil War. Susan Black's enslavement had confined her to the South Carolina Low Country from pre-adolescence through her encounter with the 36-year-old physician who also acted as her teacher. When Susan was a youth, her master commanded that she follow him into a shed. Her young mistress warned her not to go with him, telling Susan, quote, to keep away from Pa and don't go in there. Susan did not obey her master that first time, but when he demanded that she had to do so again, and her master's daughter was not available to run interference for her, Susan relented. Once inside, her owner immediately grabbed her, stuffed his handkerchief into her mouth, and viciously raped the 12-year-old. Susan was so physically damaged from her master's sexual assault that it took her 3 weeks, and 3 weeks is a long time in the history of slave labor, before she could return to her work, to her other duties. Her post-traumatic stress from her abuse lasted certainly through the time that she met Dr. Hawks some 24 years later. This was not the last time Susan's master would rape her, nor was he the only master who would try to do so. Susan's owner continued to rape her for much of her adolescence. In Dr. Hawks' words, quote, he used her as he liked. While you contemplate these words, also consider the lack of protection that Susan had from the local criminal justice system that never would have entertained that a slave female would have been a rape victim of her elite white master, or had the right to testify against him, because, of course, enslaved people did not have the right to testify against whites. She also could receive no obvious protection from her enslaved family, and was offered none, at least not at first, from the free white people who were members of her owner's family and clearly knew the abuse she suffered, except that first vague warning from her young mistress. The devastation of Susan's owner's legal license to abuse the girl brutalized not only her, but her family, and not just in the devastating ways that we can all imagine. That first year of her forced concubinage, Susan gave birth to her owner's child. She refused to care for the male infant that was the result of her violent assault, and the baby was given to her sister to rear. He was the only child that Susan would even bear. Her owner was suspicious that Susan, still a young teen, was aborting her children and therefore depriving him of additional slave property, highly valuable property according to him, because he liked, quote, her African breed. He beat her viciously as a punishment. Susan, of course, could have been barren for a number of reasons. Perceived by her owner as his personal portal for violent sexual mastery and performance and the production of future wealth, she did not receive the benefit of his doubt. As an adult, Susan came to live with the young mistress, the same one who had warned her about her father and her mistress's husband, Henry Rivers. Her mistress had an attachment of sort for Susan. She had the slave woman participate in her wedding and also encouraged Susan to marry herself, providing the slave woman with a, quote, real wedding in church. Susan's marriage nuptials, of course, came with none of the legal or customary protections of those of free white men and women. This sacramental inequality was painfully clear in Susan's husband's abroad status, that is, he did not live with her, and certainly once he escaped without her at the onset of the Civil War to join the Union forces. Susan's master himself, a major in the Army of the Confederate States, wasted little time trying to take advantage of Susan's fugitive status, of Susan's husband's fugitive status. Henry Rivers' sexual pursuit of Susan rapidly escalated to obsession, like Weinstein, perhaps. Susan tried to avoid his advances for her own sake. And I want you to listen to how close this is to what we hear today when these women testify in the hashtag #MeToo and the hashtag Time's Up. Susan tried to avoid his advances for her own sake and also for that of her mistress. At first, Rivers pled with Susan. Then he offered her money. Later came threats of violence, and then a sadistic whipping. Rivers had Susan stripped naked and tied up, and then he personally beat her mercilessly. His whipping targeted her pubis, causing blood to flow onto the floor, followed by great pain and swelling. Susan bore the great white scars from his beating also on her arms, legs, and across her body. Her story ends, that part of it told at least by Dr. Hawkes, at any rate, when Susan managed to escape to Charleston, was hidden successfully by her father, and eventually was reunited with her husband, who had enlisted in the 1st South Carolina Volunteers. Now, countless women and girls in Atlantic world slave societies, including the United States, suffered rape, death, and torturous punishments, including whippings, punches, slaps, brandings, slit ears and noses, lacerated backs, torn off breasts, broken bones, chopped off limbs, shackled feet, hands and mouth, spine curving enclosures, starvation, denial of medical attention, dehydration, broken skulls, shaved heads, scalding, loss and abuse of their children and kin. Their stories have much to tell us about the unimaginable inhumanity of the powerful and the boundless humanity of those considered without power, but who strive mightily to be free, safe, respected, and well. Hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag #MeToo, hashtag Time's Up. Thank you.
That was awesome. It gives me great pleasure to next introduce Dion Fountaine Raymond, who is Discrimination Prevention Officer and Discrimination Prevention Coordinator at UCLA. She is what I've learned folks colloquially refer to as a double Bruin. She has a Bachelor's of Arts degree in English from UCLA and also a Juris Doctorate degree from UCLA Hastings College of the Law. She also, I would say, is a triple Bruin because her baby is here in the school as well, right? Shout out to Craig somewhere, right? She is an experienced trial attorney with civil and criminal trial experience representing both plaintiffs and defendants in employment law, personal injury, and criminal defense. She is a member of the Association of Workplace Investigators and an active member of the State Bar of California. And I would be remiss if I didn't note that she always puts in a good word for the legendary Johnny Cochran as well. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you all to Dion.
My comfort zone is talking to juries, and so I'm more comfortable standing actually when I talk. So I'm just the lawyer in this group. I'm really trusting Marcus. This takes me out of my comfort zone, but here we go. My son is here today. Marcus gave us an assignment, And so part of it is to, keep it between 10 and 12 minutes. So I'm gonna ask my son to just flag me once I hit 10 minutes. While the relevance of why Black women's lives and histories matter is obvious for so many reasons and on so many levels, less obvious for me was where to begin. Fortunately for me, I'm here with two academicians who represent the historical lens through which to articulate this topic, or not. But certainly that body of information is available to them, and I am so glad that we have individuals such as yourselves. On the other hand, I am just a lawyer by trade, but that aspect of my life really only tells very little about the lens through which I view this topic. My natural inclination was to talk about this from perhaps a legal point of view, particularly my work in the criminal justice system representing juveniles. But I decided, after all, to take a more personal approach. When Marcus emailed me the invitation to join this panel for discussion, without thinking, I said yes. And I'm glad that I did. If I had paused for even a moment, I'm sure the left side of my brain that's coupled with my Virgo sensibilities, which always strive to keep me reasonable and safe, if I had really thought about it, I would have said no. But in winning, I'd be in the audience enjoying this program from your perspective while missing the lesson from me and pausing, not only to consider Black women's lives and histories and how and why they matter, and putting to paper. This has been my lesson. I soon realized that I didn't need to reach far and back from my thoughts, ideas, for there are certain women who easily appeared before the television screen of my mind. For I am indeed anchored in the richness of a fabric known as Black woman, threaded and sewn together with stories and experiences and emotions and love that create histories as diverse, beautiful, and complex as the manner in which they're woven and maintained. Excuse me, I am getting over a thing. So it is from this place that I wish to invite you, if you'll join with me for a moment of silence in honoring my and all of our ancestral mothers, aunties, grandmothers, and spiritual avatars who have come before us and still lead through wisdom, love from a silent, invisible realm. I had a nice occasion to think about Black women's lives and histories while in a traditional and culturally Black sacred place, the kitchen. And it was on Super Bowl Sunday. Instead of attending the annual party that my friend Benny Blades has every year, I chose to black out the entire NFL season, particularly their high point, the Super Bowl in support of Colin Kaepernick. While cooking and thinking, three women in particular came to mind. First, my mother. The other two are the pillars in a reoccurring theme I now refer to as Linda, Donnie, and me. And although I am many things, the common thing among these three women and the four of us is rooted in mother, a powerful and driving force in Black women's lives and histories, and that always matters. First, my mother. For raising me and my three sisters without 1 ounce of any sense of inferiority or deficiency, nor with any sense of entitlement. And that entitlement part really didn't land on me until I reached the stage of maturity. Simply put, if you really want to empower someone, teach them responsibility and accountability. In addition to being and feeling unconditionally loved, there was a consistent pattern and practice of accountability, along with the expectation that we would always do and give our best. There were routine, if not daily, house chores because everyone had something to contribute and was expected to do so. By age 14 and 15, we had to go out and get a summer job. Now, my dad was on board and supported this, but mom was clearly the one driving that train. I'm raising them to be women, independent and empowered to plot the course of their own lives. Excuse me. This alone was, I think, a real turning point because it enabled me to make decisions for myself and later on behalf of my son for his well-being. The other part of this story is that, and I hope my mother doesn't mind me sharing this, is that she made one of those turning point decisions which if she hadn't, could have set my sisters and me on a very different path. I'll never know, and I'm glad I won't. It was not uncommon at the time, certainly not in my family, for a wife and mother, particularly one with a 1-year-old and newborn, to leave her husband. At the time, my mother had not gone to college. Later, she transferred to West LA, from West LA to UCLA, where she received her Bachelor of Arts degree and master's degrees in history, and my mother is connected to Brenda in that way. So one night, to escape violence, my mother left the house at night in her nightgown. This was in the early 60s, and the police would not assist her in going back home to get me and my older sister. So she returned later to get us, which meant subjecting herself to further violence. When she had the opportunity to get out, she got out with the two of us, our things, and pregnant with my younger sister. All of her clothes had been destroyed. She returned to our grandparents' home with us at a time when my grandfather was dying of pancreatic cancer and passed away 2 months before my younger sister was born. I ask you, do Black women's lives matter? No doubt. Does this history matter? It mattered to me, to my sisters, and I think most of all to my mother. It mattered far beyond her survival instinct. It mattered to her that she be able to raise healthy female daughters into strong women. My mother did not grow up in an abusive household, but it was also important to her that she create a template for us of a woman who was more empowered than her mother, given those times. And so I'm not casting any shade, but what I'm speaking to is a woman who consciously sought, shade that is on my grandmother, who sought, as many of us do, and as our ancestors have done, and as I am doing, which is to do that thing that allows us to be better. We need to do better, grow, reach higher. Fortunately, I had a familial experience that involved some balance and support of Black women through my uncles, and the man who gave us his name, helped to raise us, and who used to say that he married my mother in order to have us, Kenneth Raymond. In so doing, he went from being a father of one to a father of 4 daughters, all a year apart. I want to acknowledge not only the significance of my mother's journey, but also that it includes chapters with male characters loving and supporting Black women whose lives and histories matter. Empowered by my mother's values, I consciously became a mother with the unconscious expectation that I would parent in the manner that closely resembled my experience. My mother's advice was to 1, get your bluff in early, and 2, whatever you do, be consistent. Other than that, very little about my parenting experience was the same or even close. And this was very disconcerting for me. My parents were working grandparents. We had a very active, extended family, but all of my sisters live outside LA County, and most of my cousins, who were more like siblings than cousins. And I was practicing law, which as a trial lawyer required that I refer to what I refer to as harnessing a lot of masculine energy. I had the dual responsibility of being mother and mostly father in ways I had not expected to carry, and it felt heavy. Enter Linda and Donnie. Donnie, my good friend since FSP and former roommate here at UCLA. Linda, my new neighbor after I had moved with my son when he was only 6 weeks old. The long and short of it was that these 2 women in particular had expanded from me my concept of what it meant to be mother in a non-traditional Western European nuclear family kind of context. I had to expand that. Once I was willing to release my attachment to that paradigm, it expanded and I allowed myself to create family and community for me and my son in a healthy African-American way. In addition to being healthy, robust examples, Linda and Donnie were rocks of support through friendship and sisterhood. By their example, they helped me to expand my consciousness that resulted in greater inclusivity vis-a-vis other families in my neighborhood, my spiritual community, and friends. It was a village. And the village helped raise the child, and the child helps raise the parents and the community through their unique generational experience of their times. Black women's lives and histories matter, particularly as we sometimes strive for safe places that do not necessarily exist for us in the world. In employment, in relationships, partnerships, healthcare, or sometimes simply in just staying alive. Our lives and histories matter as much as ever as we enter a time I like to describe as the restoration of the divine feminine, which is always necessary to balance the majestic masculine. Black women's lives and histories continue to reflect back to society all the ways we must heal if we are to truly live up to what Barbara Jordan described as an America as good as its promise. As some are now acknowledging the long ignored sunken places that have long plagued too many of us from the womb to the tomb for being Black, and in particular, for being Black and woman. And because women's lives are greater than the challenges that manifest in so many ways and directions, targets of police brutality and wrongful death, disproportionate police contact, arrests, incarceration, negative stereotypes, pathologized behaviors, struggling, abandoned, or just plain unreasonable, far beyond those filters lie the truth of our magic, majesty, and enduring grace, swag, intelligence, all enveloped in whatever limitless choice of packages we may choose to showcase ourselves in at any given time. We don't turn down and we don't go home, ever. And in the words of my younger sister, we never give up. And in that spirit, I had once written this poem. At 3 years old, God showed me a pen and a sword. She told me they were the same, and to go forth and write. So I hope the words lay in your arms and hold you in a love that lengthens through time and eternity. But if they happen to pierce your heart and stab through to your soul, please know that I am not crying for therapy. I am a woman. I am Black. And I may be your therapy. Thank you.
You better work. Yeah. We only got 2 and I'm on fire. Okay, so last but certainly not least, and I always think of this, and I don't think I've ever shared this with Lola, but I'm raised in Philly, and so I always bring that with me. And there's a very famous Lola who we often forget, but I like to say her name in honor of Kimberly Crenshaw, Lola Falana, one of the most beautiful women ever, straight out of Philly. And you just embody her and so many other things, and you will come to understand and appreciate her magic after I introduce her. Funmilola Fagbamila is a Nigerian-American scholar, activist, playwright, and artist. She received her BA in Sociology and Pan-African Studies from California State University, Los Angeles in 2013. She's also an alum of the MA program in African American Studies. She recently completed the program not too long ago, just about 2 years ago, right? And now serves as an adjunct professor of Pan-African Studies at Cal State LA. As an original member of Black Lives Matter, she has been an organizer and been with the movement since its inception in 2013. While Lola's artistry is multifaceted, including spoken word and hip hop, her current project, entitled The Intersection, is a stage play on the complexities of Black identity, Black radicalism, and what she has coined as, quote, the Black liberation ego, end quote. In 2015, Lola was honored by the United States Congress and the Black Community Clergy and Labor Alliance for her commendable activist scholarship, service, and struggle. She frequently sits on community panels regarding police brutality, criminal justice, and overall wellness in Black communities, most recently presenting at a conference held at the UCLA School of Law. It is my great pleasure to introduce Funmilola.
Hey, y'all. We got to have a conversation. Y'all did so beautifully in your presentations with the information that you provided us with thus far about the significance of the contributions of Black women. I just have my thoughts. So I'm a Black girl. I'm a Black Nigerian girl. So I think about the ways in which I consider how I walk through the world, accepted and received as a Black girl, a Black woman, but then also being a Nigerian woman and what that means for my African sensibility, if you will. And so much of how we think about Black women and centering our conversation about Black women's histories, oftentimes African women get left out of that conversation. Because we do oftentimes address this from a very Western-centric lens, and so I can never ignore that piece of it because the people that raised me are African and my family is African, but we're gonna talk about that a little bit later. What I first want to address is the fact that when Marcus reached out, and I'm really grateful that you reached out, and I'm grateful to be a part of this conversation, when I thought about what you asked about, think about why Black women's histories matter, I think that untold histories matter. I think that Black women's histories are untold for the most part. I think that when we consider the fact that that men's histories are the things that get centered and make headline news, if you will, I think that that history is a history that is written of what has happened to men. I also think that when we consider what has happened specifically to Black women in the world and in this country, there's a specificity about what has happened to Black women, yes, but we can't take it out of the larger context of the fact that, like, when we consider history, it is oftentimes just a male-centric history. That's why events like this are absolutely necessary. When we think about the way in which we even conceptualize Black history, the way in which we center conversations about the things that have happened historically that have either happened to Black men or we imagine have happened to Black men. So what do I mean by that? If we consider historically the conversations about just generally Black history, if you will, if we're talking about a conversation around lynching, there's in the popular imagination, there's this conversation that happens that lynching is something that happened to Black men when we know that lynching happened to Black women as well. Rather than addressing the phenomenon of, for instance, mass rape, this is not as nearly as centered in our conversations around Black history as it would be around lynching, because we consider that as something that has happened to Black people that are gendered as male. I think that one of the things that I considered when I was considering the question was that white supremacy and patriarchy, in order for them to function properly, they rely heavily on stereotypes of Black women. That in order for them to justify their existence, then the stereotypes of Black women are absolutely necessary. That in order for these systems to, in some way, shape, or form, be validated, then the Black woman needs to be in some way objectified. She needs to be object, less than a promiscuous, a stereotype in order for these systems to exist. I think that when we consider specifically a conversation about Black women and Black women being in conversation with each other, this is left out of a conversation about Black women's histories. I think that what is centered is Black women being in partnership with Black men, Black women resisting systems under white supremacy, patriarchy, and just generally the world. But what about Black women being in conversation with one another? Like, is that actually something that is addressed? When we think about the way in which Alice Walker was engaging the work of Zora Neale Hurston, when we think about the work that Zora Neale Hurston did, if we're thinking about people that come to mind when I think about Black women's histories, their eyes were watching God. And what did Zora Neale Hurston do? She wrote a story that centered the experiences, the perspective, the humanity of a Black woman. And what was the result? Do we remember? We know that during the Harlem Renaissance that there was this pushback against Zora Neale Hurston. So as to say that she was not talking about the concepts that would move us forward, that she was talking about this Black woman having joy and having love and being fully human, and that wasn't gonna push us forward. That wasn't part of like the plan that we were setting forward. When we think about some of the more kind of significant people during that moment that were getting a great deal of attention and notoriety, we consider the criticisms of Richard Wright in saying that the work of, in essentially humanizing Black women, which what Zora Neale Hurston was doing, was not on path with what we were trying to do. That if we are joyful and if we are happy, I don't need that right now. That if we are joyful and that if we are experiencing love and we are engaging in the fullness of our humanity, then it's going to take away from the conversation of us being essentially repressed. that Black women and Black people have no business just simply being joyful and being fully human, that we must at all times be picketing something, right? That we must at all times, and this is a form of dehumanization, that we would at all times be engaging in some type of physical combat or resistance. But Zora Neale was the original carefree Black girl. If I would say, she was essentially, you know, engaging in what I would identify as the movement work of humanizing Black women. What it means for Black women to exist outside of a lens that demands that they perform for a world gaze, for a male gaze. She got flack for that, but persisted and helped to open up an avenue for us to exist outside of the expectations of the world. When I consider even in this particular moment, the Black Lives Matter movement and the way in which we have centered Black women and queer people, and then if we're talking about histories, we know that historically, the centering of Black women and queer people has been perceived of as subversive and divisive in Black liberation movements. You get where I'm coming from? So that when we do that, when we have historically done that, Black women have been called divisive, Black women have been called all of the rest of the names that y'all know already that I don't really need to get into. But in this particular moment, where you have Black women that are saying that the state violence that Black women experience oftentimes is very similar to the state violence that Black men experience. And then there are also particularly gendered ways in which Black women experience racism. But to have those conversations and say that we are going to center Black women, we are going to engage Black queer histories, that we are going to center Black girls. And then even in this particular moment, still, maybe not here, maybe not necessarily in academic spaces, but in just generally, that's still being perceived of as this like divisive force, that if we center Black women in some way, shape, or form, that we are going off of the narrative. That when we think about my brother's keeper and the way in which it was founded on this idea that yes, Black men and Black boys in a very specific way are under attack, but that when we can acknowledge that and also say at the very same time that Black women and girls suffer from the very, very similar things. When we think about the ways in which Black girls are pushed out of the educational system in a similar way that boys are, in terms of the way in which their behavior is pathologized, not understood by their teachers. They end up getting suspended at higher rates than Black boys. But then when we address these things, what happens? It's, you know, why are you trying to take the attention away? And so the reason that I bring up all of these concepts is because when we think about Black women's histories and Black girls mattering, we know that conversation has always been a site of contention. You get where I'm coming from? It's always been a site of contention. In certain spaces, maybe not so much, but in the majority of the world, yes, it is a site of contention. And I'm constantly engaging that contention. Not just in spaces like this, but in conversations with my very African family. And so so I think about the ways that African women specifically, how do African women engage in a conversation with themselves and communities, or themselves in conversation with themselves about what a liberated experience is, what a liberated femininity is, what a liberated womanhood is, and how does that look different from that which is understood through a Western lens. And I think that there are some thinkers that go unannounced, unsung, because part of what you asked us to do was think about the thinkers that go unsung. And I won't get into too much detail, but Danai Gurira wrote a play entitled Eclipse, where she talks about the experiences of Liberian women under the having to deal with the Liberian War, right? And what happens is it complicates what is understood as a liberated femininity in that moment, because it looks different from a conversation than what we would have here. But I think that we need to be open to global perspectives, specifically dealing with Black African women. When we think about thinkers like Bolanle Awe, a Nigerian professor of history, currently in Nigeria, and having to engage in these conversations about even just critiquing patriarchy, but in an environment where it's absolutely subversive to even attempt to critique patriarchy. You get what I'm saying? As opposed to, it's a different environment. And so to have to engage that, and then to do that loudly, and then to get called all of the names that you get called when you do that very loudly. And so, also, and kind of to wrap up, I don't know how long I've been going. I don't know. I got time. I got 2 minutes. Okay, let me hurry up. I think about Bring Back Our Girls. I think about the Chibok schoolgirls, and about the fact that when you have over 300 Nigerian schoolgirls go missing, and the global uproar is not nearly what would be the case if you had 300 fill in the dot, fill in the space. You understand? And so, and I observed this a few years ago, and I was floored. I was also not very surprised, but I was disgusted. And we organized around that. And I thought about the way that, when that conversation comes up, and we link that conversation to the projects of white supremacy and patriarchy that have muted the histories of Black women historically, that they say, well, that doesn't have anything to do with white supremacy and patriarchy and all of the rest, because the Nigerian people did that to themselves, because Boko Haram are Nigerians and they did that to themselves. But why does Boko Haram exist? Why does Boko Haram exist? Boko Haram exists as an outgrowth of the ethnic and cultural divides that exist in a country which is the outgrowth of the project of colonialism, which is an outgrowth of the project of white supremacy, which is an outgrowth and an influence of global patriarchy. And what these forces do is that they come together to silence the experience of Black women, Black girls, and to dehumanize Black people generally, but a very specific way in which it does that to Black women and girls, at the intersection of all of these various systems. And so, I think that when I consider Black women mattering and Black girls mattering, I think about the way in which we have to be able to be urgent about their conditions, and be able to center the well-beings of Black women, knowing that all of these various systems oftentimes not only affect the possibility of our physical bodies surviving, but our mental wellness. When we think about Eric Garner and Erica Garner, what happens to the psychology, what happens to the mind that translates into a physical unwellness where you end up perishing because of the systems that have been structured and centered as if it's a conversation that only essentially and centrally harms Black men. But what happens is that we see that that's not necessarily the case. And so I could go on about this for quite some time, but I'm gonna let us continue. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to turn my chair in a slight conversation form because I had a follow-up for the esteemed panelists. And so to preface this first, in my own class, I like to do this by show of hands. How many people are familiar with the film Hidden Figures? Oh, that's wonderful, right? And so part of what I asked the panelists, in addition to sort of taking a question as a provocation, was to also say who are some hidden figures that motivate that we should really call out during this time that we call Black History Month. And part of why this event is especially important to me, and I encourage most people to really think about what the possibilities of a Black feminist perspective do for you, is that my own feeling about this is that the source of Blackness is Black women. We all come out of a Black woman, I mean, quite literally. And so whenever there are attacks on Black women, it's fundamentally an attack on Blackness. And so I often think when we have these kinds of events, it's pretty easy to sort of like lift up the folks, I could go on and on about Michelle Obama, like I could do that work, but just beneath her feet are all of these other women. And those women do a mighty work that we don't often see. And many of those women are people who are forced sterilized. I mean, that's the end of a particular Black line right there. Many of those women are disappeared, whether it be through, mental health facilities or correctional facilities or by families or through the devastation of bodily rape or violence, that they just get disappeared. And so part of what I would love for the panelists to highlight for us are just some women we should have in mind as we march through February, who we often may not think about, who some of the folks may not know about, that are really heavy on your mind during this season.
Fannie Lou Hamer. Yes. I love Fannie Lou Hamer. I love Fannie Lou Hamer because, and I don't know, would you consider Fannie Lou Hamer like an unsung hero?
Not sung enough.
Yeah, there we go.
Right,
There we go.
not sung enough.
Yes, I just tour her, and I will say people don't always know who she is. So
Right.
yeah.
Right. I think what I mean by that is just simply not addressed enough. Not given enough credit. I think that, and there are plenty of people, but of course, I think specifically what inspires me about Fannie Lou Hamer is her willingness to make it plain. Her willingness to make it plain in ways that a lot of people during the time would not make it plain. Her willingness to address her experience and to just be plain, to not sugarcoat it, to not make it too dense, to say it in a way that everybody could hear it plainly, and to speak not only to the intellects of people, but to speak to the emotion and heart of people. If you have one, then you were going to feel her.
And one thing I really love about Fannie Lou Hamer's approach is that it is super important, at least when I think about what she shares with the world, is that she is a witness. Like, she often is sitting in a place of like, this is what I saw with my own good eyes, like this is what they said and I heard it with my own good ears. You know, this is what they did and I felt it with my own Black body. Like, she just emphasizes that, and I think this is an important part that is often present in Brenda's work, is that oftentimes, and I'd say this a lot to a lot of my students in class, is that when we think about a lot of the violence that falls upon people, we kind of sometimes focus a lot about the victim themselves, like, oh wow, like, Trayvon Martin was murdered. That is terrible. But then what about the people who are made to witness the murder? Mike Brown sat out for a long time where the community members just had to look at this dead body, just sitting there. That I think that is something that is a deep, 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 deep problem. And I think, when we think about Black women's lives and histories, it really amplifies that particular point that, Trayvon is somebody's child, somebody prayed over him, gave him a name to be called in the world, and you just look at him dead. What do you do with that? So this is like Erica Gardner. What do you do when your dad has just disappeared? One day, in the middle of the day, he just doesn't ever come home. And I think we can do better about thinking about the collective trauma of witnessing Black death that way.
Yeah, that's true.
Particularly in a time where like somebody dies and they're Black and it's everywhere. And I often think like, what does that do to us? How long does it take before you get over the spectacle? How long does that stay with you? Like just seeing dead people, like that, young dead people on top of that. So thank you. I couldn't help but think about Fannie Lou Hamer's evidence through witnessing and how testifying and witnessing such an important part of the Black experience.
Absolutely.
So other folks?
In keeping with my theme, I wanted to say the names of two people that I think no one in this room may not ever hear unless I speak their name. And one is Devin Waller, who is a graduate of UCLA in the post-2009 era. She graduated with a degree in astrophysics. And I've often, wanted to find out how many black women have graduated with a degree in astrophysics in the history of UCLA. And she went on to be accepted to an engineering program at UC Irvine, which ultimately she declined and went on and earned her master's degree in geology from the University of Arizona. And she is currently the exhibit project manager at the California Science Center, where she has worked on projects such as Space Shuttle Endeavour launch configuration, and she has worked for NASA, its funded Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter mission. And the other person I wanted to mention whose enthusiasm for life is, her name is Lee Victoria Jante, and who works in casting. And like Devin Waller, she is a graduate of the University of Arizona with degrees in psychology, theater, minor in music, and currently working in casting for Insecure, which does a lot of work in the community. And just to show the magic in the web of black women's lives, Devin is the daughter of my friend Linda, who I mentioned, who is here, Linda. And Lee is the daughter of Donnie, who I mentioned, who is here. Donnie. And one more connection, Linda and Donnie are both career educators and black women's lives and histories who matter.
Thank you.
Well, I'm going to stick with my theme too of history. Okay. So the person that that inspires me all the time is a person whose name we really don't know. We think of her as Angela, but we don't know her real name. She was baptized before being forced to board a slave ship. She was Congo, bound for Spanish America, for the Spanish American Empire. And of course, she had lost her family, and no doubt by violent means. She survived Middle Passage, which includes that she survived stench, illness, death, physical abuse, psychological trauma, dehydration, starvation, etc., etc. She was pirated twice. The boat that she was on, the ship that she was on, first by the Dutch and then by the British. And she arrived on the far-flung frontier of the British Empire in North America, close to where I grew up, on the struggling colony of Virginia in August of 1619. The first black woman, African woman, we know to have arrived in British mainland North America. She survived at least long enough for us to be able to uncover her story, and her survival paved our way for our survival.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
And in an effort to also be on task with the questions, so I didn't just ask these beautiful black women these questions that I didn't consider it myself.
Red, black, and green. Did you
Right.
notice that?
Yeah, there we go.
We didn't plan it.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the map, right?
The joke
Power
is
to
that we
the
have on
people.
red, black, and green.
Yeah, it
And
wasn't
we did not
coordinated.
plan it.
Right, it wasn't coordinated.
Okay.
Oh, man, that is magic.
Right, right,
Magic.
See how
right.
we didn't plan this.
Yeah.
We did not plan it.
Or it's just that black women are from the future. So y'all all found out and then
take that.
arrived. There we go. You know?
Black women.
So someone whenever I have the opportunity to share, so I mentioned earlier that I was raised in Philadelphia. I was born in Newark, New Jersey, on the New Ark, as I like to think about it. And when I graduated college, Columbia in 2003, a young woman named Sakia Gum was murdered in Newark, New Jersey. And many people often don't know who she is. She was a young black lesbian who was out at night with a bunch of her friends, and she had been harassed by a bunch of men, black men in particular, who, were aggressively assaulting them with rhetorical sexual innuendos. And they were rebuffed. And in particular, she rebuffed them by saying she's not into men. She loves black women. and they murder her on that corner. And I always think about her a lot because I think to myself how easy it is to forget. And if I were not from Newark, I probably wouldn't even be thinking about it a lot because there's so many different people to latch on to. But I just want to make sure that we think about those kinds of folks when we think about the intraracial dynamics of what we deal with and how women are treated amongst our own, and also how we can easily forget about those, especially if they are lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual, such. The other people I would like to thank, Funmilola, Dion, and Brenda. I want to thank you so much for giving your time, for offering this wonderful conversation, and for taking the question, I think, in its most sincere fashion, so that people are able to see all of the ways we can go and all of the places and people we can meet if we just start to really take Black women as seriously as they deserve. We start to honor them as seriously as they deserve to be honored. We don't lose anything, we just gain a whole bunch of other things. And so I just want to invite everyone to give a round of applause for our panelists. And the way that we set things up here is that as opposed to doing a whole thing, I'm just going to invite you to come up and meet these wonderful women, to shake their hand, to ask them some questions, and to just thank them for coming out today. And I look forward to hearing the conversation rotate. And I really appreciate seeing all of these beautiful people in the audience on a very late night as a fire goes off in Bel Air. Shout out to you all. Thank you so much.